So America taxed Canadian goods, and nearly 90% of the burden landed at home. The tariff was announced as a bill Canada would pay. The legal invoice went first to an American importer. The importer then had only a few choices: demand a discount from the Canadian supplier, absorb the charge inside its own margin, raise the price charged to an American customer, reduce payroll, or postpone investment. New York Federal Reserve researchers examined the 2025 tariff wave and concluded that nearly 90% of the economic burden fell on United States firms and consumers. The average tariff rate on American imports had climbed from 2.6% to 13%. A separate Federal Reserve analysis detected higher core goods prices almost immediately, and testimony submitted during the Continental Trade Review noted that roughly half of American imports from Canada are intermediate goods used to support American production, not finished luxuries sitting harmlessly on a foreign dock. Canada still paid. Canadian exporters lost orders. Plants faced weaker demand. Workers carried uncertainty. But the money did not move in the direction the political slogan implied. It moved from an American company to the United States Treasury, then from business margins into prices, wages, investment decisions, municipal tax bases, and retirement portfolios. Meanwhile, Canada's dependence on the American market fell from 75.9% of merchandise exports to 7%, while Ottawa committed $6 billion to trade corridors and Arctic infrastructure intended to reach other customers. Warren Buffett warned that tariffs become a tax on goods and that trade should not be used as a weapon. Applied here, his warning is devastating. When the weapon is paid for largely by the person firing it, while the target uses the pressure to finance an escape route, the accounting eventually overwhelms the rhetoric. When you follow the money from the customs desk to the factory floor, you will understand why the phrase "Canada pays" concealed the most important transfer in the entire dispute. Hit subscribe because this conflict will be decided by invoices, not slogans, and the next invoice is already moving through the American economy. Let me walk you through how we got here, because the tariff argument was built around a misunderstanding most voters were never shown. A tariff is collected by the government of the country imposing it. When Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, machinery, fertilizer, food, energy equipment, or automotive components enter the United States, the American importer is responsible for the duty. The foreign seller may accept a lower price to preserve the order, but there is no mechanism forcing Canada to reimburse the American importer. The burden is negotiated through the supply chain after the tax has already been imposed. The question is never whether somebody pays. The question is how the payment is divided. The World Trade Organization and standard trade definitions describe tariffs as customs duties on imported merchandise. The United States business, bringing the product across the border, encounters that duty first. That distinction matters more in the Canadian relationship than in almost any other trade dispute, because the border does not separate two self-contained production systems. It cuts through one deeply integrated system. A Canadian metal may enter an American component, return to Canada inside a larger assembly, and cross again inside a finished vehicle. Energy moves south to power American homes and factories. Potash supports American farms. Lumber enters American construction. Machinery, chemicals, aerospace parts, and food products move through firms that often plan production for the continent rather than one country. The United States Trade Representative reported that total American goods trade with Canada reached approximately $719.5 billion in 2025. American exports to Canada were about $336.5 billion, while imports were about $383 billion. The American goods deficit fell to $4 billion, but the scale of two-way trade remained enormous. This was not a small supplier being charged at the edge of the economy. It was friction inserted into one of America's largest commercial relationships. Washington's theory was straightforward. Canada was more dependent on the United States than the United States was on Canada. In 2024, 75.9% of Canadian merchandise exports went south. A larger market could therefore impose pain, wait for Canadian industries and provincial governments to pressure Ottawa, and convert that pressure into concessions. The asymmetry was real. Canadian companies could not redirect hundreds of billions of dollars in trade overnight. Canadian auto workers, steel producers, farmers, forestry communities, and energy exporters were exposed immediately. Canada initially responded in the familiar way. It imposed counter-tariffs on American products, seeking to create pressure in politically sensitive states and demonstrate that unilateral American action carried a cost. But Canadian importers paid Canadian counter-tariffs, just as American importers paid American tariffs. Ottawa eventually removed broad measures worth $44.2 billion, while preserving protection around steel, aluminum, and automobiles. That was not evidence that tariffs were harmless. It was recognition that a smaller economy could damage itself by copying the larger economy's strategy across every product category. While Washington watched the tariff lists, Canada began changing the denominator. The American share of Canadian merchandise exports fell to 71.7% in 2025. Exports to non-American markets increased 17.2%, and merchandise trade with those partners rose from $484 billion to $553 billion. The shift did not remove Canadian vulnerability. 71.7% remained an extraordinary concentration, but it proved that the number was not fixed by geography. Then the policy money followed. Ottawa launched a $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund and a $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund. The combined $6 billion was aimed at ports, railways, airports, bridges, roads, highways, deep water access, and dual civilian-military infrastructure. The stated objective was to help double non-American exports over a decade and generate roughly $300 billion in additional trade. Every additional route reduced the value of the next threat, even if the United States remained Canada's dominant customer. The public debate still asked which country was being punished. Inside companies on both sides of the border, a more precise question was being asked. Where does the tariff dollar actually go after the truck reaches customs? And the answer becomes clearest inside one American factory, where a Canadian shipment, an invoice, and a red number meet at the same table. What follows is a composite reconstruction based on Federal Reserve research, trade documentation, and the mechanics of customs collection. It is not a transcript from one identified business. The room and individuals are illustrative. The invoice chain is real. The factory sits outside Detroit, close enough to the border that trucks arriving from Ontario are routine rather than international events. Inside, metal presses work beneath fluorescent lights. Forklifts move between racks. A Canadian component enters this facility because the supplier has met the company's engineering specifications for years. Upstairs, the finance room is quieter. A rectangular table stands beneath a screen used for monthly operating reviews. The afternoon sky is gray beyond the blinds. 3 people are seated: the chief financial officer, the purchasing director, and the plant manager. A 4th joins by video from the company's customs broker. In front of the finance chief is the entry package for a shipment from Canada. The commercial invoice shows the supplier's price. The transport document shows the route. The customs entry shows the classification, declared value, and additional duty. The tariff appears as one red line. No Canadian government account is listed beside it. No foreign treasury is instructed to transfer the money. The company importing the goods owes the charge to the United States government. The finance chief places a finger on the red line and asks the question that decides everything after it: how much can be recovered? The purchasing director has already called the supplier. The Canadian company will consider a limited discount because losing the American customer would hurt its workers. But it cannot absorb the full tariff. Its labor, energy, raw materials, debt, and transport costs have not disappeared. If it accepts the entire reduction, the order may remain profitable for the American buyer and become unprofitable for the Canadian seller. The finance chief asks whether another supplier exists. One American company cannot meet the required volume for several months and quotes a higher base price. An overseas alternative introduces shipping time, quality validation, currency exposure, and the risk of another tariff. The Canadian supplier remains the operationally safest choice. The tariff has not created an American factory overnight. It has changed the price of the existing choice. On the screen, the customs broker confirms the payment deadline. The money must leave the American company. Silence. 5 seconds. Then 10. The plant manager looks through the glass wall toward the production floor. Below him, workers feed material into machines purchased on the assumption of predictable continental trade. The tariff line is not large enough to close the plant that afternoon. It is large enough to alter every decision surrounding it. The finance chief writes 5 words on a yellow pad: supplier, margin, customer, payroll, investment. Those are the 5 places the cost can go. The Canadian supplier may accept part of it through a lower price. That is Canadian pain, weaker earnings, less hiring, and perhaps reduced production. The American company may absorb part. That is shareholder pain, less cash for equipment, dividends, debt repayment, or retirement accounts holding the stock. The company may raise its selling price. That is customer pain. The plant may reduce overtime or delay hiring. That is worker pain. The machine upgrade may be postponed. That is future productivity sacrificed to pay a present tax. There is no 6th column labeled foreign government. The purchasing director opens a spreadsheet showing 3 scenarios. In the first, the supplier cuts its price slightly, and the American company absorbs the rest. In the second, the company raises customer prices. In the third, it changes suppliers over 18 months. Every scenario has a cost. The first reduces margins. The second risks losing customers. The third requires testing, engineering work, inventory buffers, and the possibility of production failure. The tariff was supposed to make the Canadian product less attractive. It succeeds. But making the Canadian product less attractive is not the same as making an American alternative ready, cheap, and reliable. Between those 2 conditions lies the payment gap. The American importer lives inside that gap. The finance chief asks what other companies are doing. The broker summarizes what surveys later documented. Some firms are passing the full cost through. Others are sharing it with customers. Manufacturers with limited pricing power are absorbing more. Companies are bringing inventory forward, renegotiating contracts, seeking exemptions, and delaying capital decisions. New York Fed surveys found that most businesses passed at least some tariff-induced costs to customers. Nearly 1/3 of manufacturers and about 45% of service firms reported passing all of the increase through. The plant manager turns to the capital budget. A new automated line was scheduled for approval. It would improve productivity and strengthen the company's ability to compete with foreign producers. The cash intended for that project is now being reconsidered because working capital requirements have risen. The irony is exact. A tariff intended to strengthen American production is competing directly with an investment intended to strengthen American production. No one raises a voice. The finance chief closes the capital budget and leaves the customs invoice open. The future investment is closed. The present tax remains open. Downstairs, the machines continue running. The workers have not been told that trade policy has entered the overtime schedule. The customer has not yet received a higher price. The pension fund has not marked down the shares. Those consequences remain choices. But the money has already moved. It moved from an American bank account to the American Treasury. The company now has to decide who receives the loss. The chief financial officer circles the red number, then draws arrows toward margin, price, payroll, and investment. The arrows do not point north. The company will demand a partial Canadian discount, raise selected prices, freeze one open position, and delay the machine purchase. The burden will be divided. That division is what the New York Fed measured at scale, nearly 90% falling on American firms and consumers. The invoice is carried to accounts payable, the tax is processed, and only after the money has left the American company does the political argument begin claiming that Canada paid it. But once thousands of firms make the same decision, the private invoice becomes a national reaction. The aftermath emerged in prices, margins, trade flows, and investment plans, rather than one single collapse. Federal Reserve researchers found that the 2025 tariffs raised core goods prices by roughly 0.3% in the early phase, adding about 0.1% to the broader core personal consumption price index. That may sound small, but a national price index compresses thousands of products and services into one average. The impact is concentrated in categories where imports or imported inputs are difficult to replace. A household does not experience a national average. It experiences the specific appliance, vehicle part, building material, tool, or food product whose price changed. The pressure also moved through business margins. The New York Fed's latest surveys found that 2/3 of service firms and almost all manufacturers responding imported at least some inputs. When those costs rose, companies did not respond uniformly. Firms with market power raised prices. Firms facing resistant customers accepted smaller margins. Others renegotiated contracts, reduced purchases, or waited to invest. Researchers warned in July 2026 that additional pass-through was still in the pipeline. That phrase should genuinely alarm anyone living on wages or retirement income. Still in the pipeline means the customs payment can occur months before its full household consequence appears. Existing inventories may have been purchased before the tariff. Annual contracts may temporarily hold prices down. A company may absorb costs until its margin becomes unsustainable. When those buffers expire, the higher charge emerges in a new price list, a reduced benefit, a smaller bonus, or an investment that never receives approval. Canada experienced the other side of the transaction. American tariffs reduced demand for Canadian products and created uncertainty across export industries. Statistics Canada recorded sharp declines in exports to the United States during the escalation. Workers in autos, metals, forestry, agriculture, and manufacturing faced reduced hours and delayed projects. A Canadian exporter granting a discount to preserve an American order is paying part of the tariff economically, even though it is not writing the customs check. That distinction keeps the analysis honest. The tariff does hurt Canada. It simply does not mean Canada alone pays. Ottawa responded by removing broad counter tariffs that were raising costs for Canadian importers while maintaining measures around strategic sectors. It also redirected resources toward export finance, business support, and infrastructure. The $6 billion corridor strategy was not free money. Canadian taxpayers were financing ports, railways, airports, bridges, roads, and Arctic routes, partly because the American market had become less predictable. Canada therefore paid through weaker export revenue, worker support, industrial assistance, and the expense of diversification. But that Canadian spending created an asset. American tariff payments created federal revenue and domestic cost. Canadian diversification spending created infrastructure intended to lower future exposure. That difference is visible in the movement from 75.9% to 71.7%. Canada's non-American merchandise exports rose 17.2%. The United States remained dominant, but the concentration declined while the burden on American companies approached 90%. One side was paying a recurring customs cost. The other was paying to change the structure behind the next negotiation. Public statements continued emphasizing strength in foreign payment. Corporate behavior told a different story. American firms adjusted prices and margins. Canadian firms adjusted customers and routes. The first adjustment can reverse when a tariff disappears. The second may remain because a foreign contract, certified supplier, or completed terminal does not vanish with the political announcement. And then the question moved beyond who writes the check. Warren Buffett's logic asks whether the asset created by the policy is worth the permanent behavior the policy produces. Buffett's first principle is brutally plain. A tax is not transformed into foreign money merely because it is attached to a foreign product. The American importer writes the check. From that point, the burden becomes a negotiation. The Canadian supplier may surrender some margin. The American distributor may surrender some margin. The customer may pay a higher price. The worker may lose overtime. The shareholder may receive a lower return. The planned machine may remain unpurchased. The nearly 90% finding does not mean Canadian producers were unharmed. It means the broad economic incidence, the final burden after prices and contracts adjusted, remained overwhelmingly inside the United States. That is the economic translation Washington's political language avoided. Buffett's second principle concerns productive assets. Paying a customs duty does not build a mill. It does not train a machinist. It does not expand an aluminum smelter, certify a new automotive supplier, generate electricity, or construct a railway connection. It can improve the relative position of an existing domestic producer by raising a foreign competitor's price. But when downstream companies use the taxed product, the same measure can raise the cost of American production. The distinction resembles a company increasing the price of a critical internal service and then declaring the rest of the organization stronger because one department's revenue rose. The accounting may show income in one place. The consolidated business may become less competitive. Buffett's third principle is opportunity cost. Every dollar absorbed by the Detroit area manufacturer's tariff is a dollar unavailable for something else. It may have funded the automated line, reduced debt, supported a pension contribution, financed research, or protected employment during a downturn. The Treasury receives revenue, but the private economy loses discretion over the same dollar. Government may use that revenue productively. It may reduce borrowing or finance public priorities. But the tariff's value cannot be judged by pointing only to the revenue line. The lost private investment, higher price, and changed supply chain belong in the same calculation. In more than 60 years of investing, acquiring businesses, and evaluating management, the Buffett method has emphasized total economics rather than the most flattering line in an account. Revenue without attention to cost is not profit. Activity without return is not value creation. A policy producing visible customs receipts while imposing diffuse costs across thousands of firms can look stronger, precisely because the losses are harder to photograph. The fourth principle is customer behavior. Canada received a clear signal. Access to the American market could be used repeatedly as leverage. A rational supplier facing one dominant customer responds by seeking a second customer, even when the second customer is farther away or initially less profitable. The immediate return may be lower. The strategic value lies in the ability to refuse the worst future demand. That is what 71.7% measures. It is not freedom from the United States. It is the beginning of optionality. That is what the $6 billion measures. It is not proof that every Canadian corridor will succeed. It is the purchase price of insurance. Buffett's fifth principle is the margin of safety. Canada's old structure was efficient but concentrated. 75.9% of merchandise exports relied on one market. Efficiency produced wealth until political uncertainty revealed how little room existed for error. Lowering the number to 71.7% created a small margin. The $6 billion is meant to widen it. For the United States, the same process erodes a hidden asset, preferred customer status. American proximity, scale, and infrastructure will keep the United States central to Canada. But central is not the same as exclusive. Each new Canadian route or customer reduces the amount of pressure required to make Ottawa search for alternatives and increases the amount required to force a concession. Under the Buffett lens, the devastating verdict is this: America collected the tariff, but Canada collected the lesson. The tariff dollar may be spent once, the lesson compounds, and the next consequences move from household economics into politics, defense, and the institutional architecture of North America. The first cascading consequence is inflation pressure concentrated in ordinary production. A tariff on a finished luxury item can remain relatively contained. A tariff on an intermediate good enters many products. Testimony during the Continental Trade Review stated that roughly half of American imports from Canada are intermediate goods supporting American production. The border charge can therefore move through machinery, vehicles, construction, packaging, food processing, energy systems, and public procurement before reaching a final customer. The second consequence is weaker investment. Companies do not need to close a factory for the policy to impose a long-term cost. They can delay one production line, reduce one research budget, hold more inventory, or require a higher return before approving a plant. Trade uncertainty affects lending and capital allocation because boards cannot price projects confidently when input rates, classifications, exemptions, and legal authorities may change. Research has connected tariff uncertainty with weaker investment, consumption, and employment outcomes. For viewers between 45 and 75, that cost can appear inside retirement savings before it appears in a headline. Industrial companies face smaller margins, retailers face customer resistance, banks finance more cautious borrowers, automakers redesign sourcing. A diversified retirement account owns pieces of all those decisions. The third consequence is Canadian restructuring. The movement to 71, 7% may reverse in some years, but infrastructure makes the direction more durable. The $6 billion program is intended to modernize ports, railways, airports, roads, bridges, and northern routes. Those assets do not require Canada to abandon America. They need only allow more production to reach Europe, Asia, and other partners when American access is disrupted. The fourth consequence is political pressure inside American states. Canada bought approximately $336.5 billion in American goods in 2025. American farmers, manufacturers, energy companies, and logistics providers depend on Canadian customers. Retaliation and Canadian substitution therefore travel through congressional districts. A tariff supporting one constituency can harm another that loses a buyer or pays more for an input. The fifth consequence is institutional erosion. The USIM call was designed to give companies predictable rules, yet rising rates and complex compliance requirements forced importers to spend more on documentation, classification, origin rules, legal review, and inventory planning. Federal Reserve researchers noted that the average effective tariff rate moved from roughly 2.3% in 2024 to more than 13% by mid-2025. An agreement can remain legally alive and become economically less valuable when companies stop trusting the environment around it. The sixth consequence is defense. NORAD, Five Eyes cooperation, Arctic security, and North American defense production depend on integrated infrastructure and trusted supply chains. The $1 billion Arctic component of the $6 billion strategy explicitly supports infrastructure with civilian and military applications. Better Canadian infrastructure can strengthen continental defense. But if Canada builds sovereign capacity because it distrusts economic access, future procurement may prioritize redundancy over integration, raising costs for both allies. The seventh consequence is international signaling. Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and Australia see that the American importer encounters the tax first. They see nearly 90% of the burden remaining inside America. They also see Canada respond with $6 billion in physical insurance and a decline to 71.7%. China and Russia do not need the alliance to collapse. They benefit when Western partners spend capital duplicating supply chains and defending against one another's policies, while Arctic and technological competition intensifies. And here is the devastating irony. The tariffs were supposed to increase American leverage. Nearly 90% of the burden fell on American firms and consumers. They were supposed to encourage domestic investment. Some firms delayed investment to absorb the cost. They were supposed to reinforce American centrality. Canada moved from 75.9% to 71.7% and committed $6 billion to routes beyond the United States. The policy hurts Canada. It also finances the argument and infrastructure required to make Canada harder to pressure next time. Higher costs weaken support. Uncertainty delays investment. Diversification lowers future leverage. Lower leverage encourages stronger pressure. Stronger pressure produces more domestic cost and more diversification. This is a compounding system, and compounding systems become dangerous when leaders follow the headline instead of the money. America's tariffs were supposed to send one unmistakable message: access to the American market has a price, and Canada would pay it. The accounting tells a more complicated and more consequential story. The American importer writes the customs check. The Canadian supplier may surrender part of its margin. The American business may absorb another part. The customer may pay more. The worker may lose hours. The machine purchase may be delayed. The retirement portfolio may hold the company whose earnings decline. Canada pays through lost orders, weaker growth, worker support, and the expense of building alternatives. America pays through prices, margins, wages, investment, and uncertainty. The New York Fed's nearly 90% finding does not erase Canadian damage. It destroys the claim that the burden can be placed cleanly outside the United States. 75.9% became 71.7%. $6 billion moved toward ports, railways, airports, bridges, roads, highways, and Arctic infrastructure. Those numbers describe the second bill, the one that does not arrive at customs. It arrives when Canada signs another overseas contract. It arrives when an American manufacturer postpones a productivity investment. It arrives when a supply chain designed for continental efficiency is redesigned for political survival. The philosophical lesson is simple. Economic power is not measured only by the ability to impose a cost. It is measured by whether imposing that cost improves the position of the country using it. A tariff that protects a truly strategic industry may serve a defensible purpose. A tariff judged only by the money collected at the border can conceal larger losses moving through the economy behind it. Buffett's warning applied here is not that trade must remain naive or undefended. It is that accounting must remain honest. Revenue is not automatically profit. Pressure is not automatically leverage. And a foreign product does not make the domestic tax foreign. Watch the nearly 90% burden. Watch 71.7%. Watch where the $6 billion is built. The tariff invoice has already been paid. The larger bill is still moving through the system, and the next company deciding whether to raise prices, cut hours, or cancel investment may never appear in the official announcement.
Spin kapanashi makhj zama pat paspin kapanashi sabar ba mizrasta dadidanshi sabar ba mizrasta dadidanshi makhj zama pat paspin kapanashi makhj zama pat paspin kapanashi صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي سترګې ټول کمې بدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم اوس کله علاج مې په لندن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اسه به خراب د مینې خوان شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه دې برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه دې برباد عبدل زرین کړما په आवाज د خالد شامل زړه پیوان شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي